The first time I saw him, I was running late to work. My heart was already racing from the dash through the lobby, my heels clacking against the polished marble floor. Just as I was about to push open the elevator door, he appeared beside me, tall with dark hair, and a gaze so intense it could stop time. He was calm, collected, while I fumbled with my bag and tried not to let my gaze linger too long. The elevator doors slid shut, and we were alone in the quiet, closed space. I could feel his eyes on me, studying me with a quiet confidence that sent shivers down my spine. I glanced over, catching his eyes briefly, feeling my cheeks burn as I looked away. He didn't speak, but somehow his presence filled the entire elevator, commanding my attention without a single word. As we reached our floor, he stepped out first, giving me a small knowing smile over his shoulder. It wasn't until later that morning, during a team meeting, that I realized he wasn't just any colleague. He was the boss, the new CEO everyone had been buzzing about. Alexander Knight. I tried to keep my distance, tried to focus on my work. But as the days passed, I found it impossible. It seemed like everywhere I turned, he was there. Silent, watchful, with that slow, assessing smile that made my heart race. Our glances turned into longer looks, his eyes catching mine in a way that felt like a secret message only we understood. One afternoon, I was in the copy room, struggling with the machine. It had jammed yet again, and I was ready to throw the entire thing out the window. I let out a frustrated groan, just as I heard someone enter behind me. I didn't have to turn to know who it was. Having trouble? His voice was deep, and it made me jump. I turned to face him, trying to hide my flushed cheeks. "Just this machine," I muttered, feeling foolish under his amused gaze. "It's always jamming on me." He stepped closer, so close I could feel his warmth. "May I?" His hand brushed mine as he reached for the machine, and I felt a spark that left me breathless. He was so close that I could smell his cologne, clean, with a hint of spice. "Thank you," I managed, my voice barely a whisper. My heart hammered in my chest, and I couldn't bring myself to step back. I watched as he fixed the machine with a few simple movements, then handed me the paper I had been waiting on. "Here you go," he said, his hand lingering on mine for a moment longer than necessary. Our eyes met, and for a split second, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. I knew I should pull away, but something held me in place. His gaze softened, and he gave me a small, crooked smile that made my stomach flutter. "Thank you," I said again, my voice embarrassingly breathy. "My pleasure." His voice was low, almost a murmur, and I felt his gaze sweep over me, taking in every detail. Then, just as quickly, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, breathless and completely enchanted. Over the next few days, I tried to shake off the effect Alexander had on me. But every time I saw him, my heart betrayed me, beating faster at the sight of his strong, steady presence. We continued to exchange glances, stolen moments that seemed to stretch longer each time. One evening, as I was finishing up a report, I noticed the office was nearly empty. Only a few desks were still lit, including the one in Alexander's office. His door was open, and from where I sat, I could see him working, his expression focused. His presence drew me in like a magnet, and before I knew it, I found myself walking toward his office, my heart pounding with each step. I knocked softly on the door frame, and he looked up, surprised but pleased to see me. "Amelia," he said, his voice warm and inviting. "Still here?" I nodded, feeling a sudden burst of nerves. "I wanted to finish that report," I replied, trying to sound professional. He leaned back in his chair, watching me with that intense gaze. I admire that dedication. I felt a thrill at his words, a warmth spreading through me. "Thank you, Mr. Knight." He laughed softly, and the sound sent a shiver down my spine. "Alexander," he corrected, his eyes holding mine. We don't need formalities, do we? I swallowed, feeling suddenly shy under his gaze. Okay. Alexander. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit for a moment, he said, his tone almost casual, but there was something in his eyes that made my pulse race. I sat down, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. Our eyes met, and it felt like he could see right through me, as if he knew the effect he had on me. We talked about work, small things that I barely registered, lost in the sound of his voice. His gaze never left me, and I felt myself leaning forward, drawn in by the quiet intensity in his eyes. Amelia, he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. Do you know how hard it's been to keep my distance? My breath caught, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't understand. He leaned forward, his hand reaching across the desk, resting lightly on mine. I think you do, he murmured, his fingers tracing a soft line across my skin. There's something between us, isn't there? I felt a shiver run through me, a thrill that was both terrifying and exhilarating. His hand was warm on mine, grounding me as his eyes held me captive. Yes, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I feel it too. He gave me that slow, knowing smile, his thumb tracing gentle circles on my hand. Then maybe we should stop pretending we don't. Before I could respond, he stood, moving around the desk until he was right in front of me, looking down with an intensity that made my knees weak. His hand reached out, tucking a stray strand of hair behind my ear. His touch was gentle, his fingers lingering for a moment before sliding down my jawline, tracing the curve of my cheek. Amelia, he murmured, his voice like a caress. I don't usually break my own rules. But with you, I want to. I felt a thrill race through me, my heart pounding wildly as I looked up at him. His face was so close, his breath warm on my skin. I knew I should pull back, should walk away. But as he leaned down, his lips just inches from mine, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I didn't want to be anywhere else. I woke up the next morning with my head spinning, the memory of Alexander's kiss fresh in my mind. I could still feel his warm lips against mine, his hand firm at the small of my back, pulling me close in that dimly lit office. The memory sent a thrill through me, but there was also a nervous flutter in my stomach. I knew I'd be seeing him today, and I wasn't sure what to expect. How would he act? How would I act? I got ready for work with shaky hands, applying my makeup with a little extra care, picking out a dress that hugged my figure without feeling too obvious. When I finally stepped into the office, I forced myself to look straight ahead, willing my heart to calm down as I walked through the lobby, past the familiar faces of my colleagues. As I approached my desk, I caught a glimpse of him through his open office door. He was sitting at his desk, typing, but he looked up just as I walked by, his gaze catching mine. For a moment, everything else faded away. His eyes held me in place, and I saw the faintest smile curve his lips, sending a rush of warmth through me. Amelia, he called softly. I hesitated, then turned and took a step toward his office. My heart beat wildly as I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving me. Good morning, he said, his voice low, his eyes dark and intense. Good morning, Alexander, I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper. He gestured to the seat across from him. I sat, my pulse quickening as he studied me in silence for a moment. The tension between us felt electric, and I was acutely aware of every movement, every breath. Last night, he began, his voice a gentle murmur, was unexpected. I swallowed, my cheeks heating up as I looked down. Yes, it was. I felt embarrassed admitting it, but I couldn't deny the truth. Being with him felt like stepping into a dream I hadn't dared imagine. I should tell you that I don't usually cross these lines with anyone here. He leaned forward, his gaze softening as he continued. But with you, Amelia, I feel something I can't ignore. My heart skipped a beat, and I looked up, meeting his gaze. I feel it too, I admitted, feeling vulnerable but unable to hide the truth any longer. He smiled, his expression one of relief and something else, a quiet intensity that made my pulse race. Then let's see where this takes us, he said softly. I nodded, my heart pounding as he stood and walked around his desk, his steps slow and deliberate. When he reached me, he extended his hand, his fingers brushing against mine as he helped me to my feet. He didn't let go, his hand warm in mine as he guided me closer to him. I felt my cheeks flush as he leaned in, his breath warm on my skin. Amelia, he murmured, his voice low and full of desire. Tell me if this is too much. I felt a shiver run through me as I shook my head. No, I whispered, my voice trembling. It's not too much. With a gentle smile, he pulled me closer, his hands resting on my hips. I felt my body melt into his, my heart racing as his lips brushed my forehead, trailing down to my cheek, before finding my lips in a soft, lingering kiss that left me breathless. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of secret meetings, stolen glances, and quiet moments that felt like they belonged in another world. Each day, we found new ways to slip away from the office and steal precious minutes alone. Sometimes it was in his office, where he would pull me close, his hands warm and firm as he traced gentle circles on my back. Other times, we'd meet in a quiet cafe across town, where we'd talk, laugh, and lose ourselves in each other's company. One evening, Alexander surprised me by suggesting a late-night drive. The city lights sparkled around us as he drove down empty streets, his hand resting comfortably on my knee. I leaned back, feeling safe and completely enchanted by the way he made me feel. We pulled up to a secluded spot overlooking the city, the view stretching out before us like a scene from a dream. Alexander turned to me, his gaze intense and filled with unspoken words. In the quiet of the car, he took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. You know, he said softly, I never expected someone to come into my life and turn everything upside down. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. I could say the same. He leaned closer, his hand reaching up to cup my cheek as he studied my face. His eyes filled with a mix of admiration and something deeper. Being with you, Amelia. It feels like something I've wanted forever. I felt a blush rise to my cheeks, my heart fluttering at his words. I leaned in, our lips meeting in a kiss that was tender and filled with all the things we hadn't yet said. When we finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against mine, our breaths mingling as we held each other in the stillness of the night. The next morning, I arrived at work feeling lighter than air, a permanent smile on my face. But my mood shifted when I found an email waiting for me from the Human Resources Department, requesting a private meeting. I frowned, a sense of unease creeping in as I clicked on the message, reading it carefully. The meeting was scheduled for that afternoon. My mind raced with questions, my nerves tingling with worry. Was it about my performance? Had someone noticed the time I spent with Alexander? When I walked into the HR office later that day, I was met with a polite but stern look from the head of the department. Amelia, she said, her tone formal. We've received reports of interactions between you and Mr. Knight. As you know, our company has a strict policy regarding personal relationships between employees, especially with someone in a position of power. My heart sank as I realized what this meant. My mind spun, trying to think of something to say, but all I could manage was a quiet, I understand. You'll need to make a decision, Amelia, she continued, her gaze softening just slightly. If you choose to pursue this relationship, there will be consequences. I suggest you take some time to consider what's best for both your career and your future. I left the meeting feeling shaken, the weight of the situation settling heavily on my shoulders. I wanted to be with Alexander, but now I could see the difficult path ahead. The reality of our relationship, and the obstacles we would face, loomed large. That evening, I met Alexander in his office. He could see the worry in my eyes as I walked in, and he pulled me into his arms, holding me close as I explained the situation. His face grew serious, his hands tightening around mine. "I'm willing to take the risk," he murmured, his voice a steady promise. "But this is your choice, Amelia. I won't ask you to stay if it costs you too much." I looked up at him, feeling a mix of fear and determination. Despite the challenges, I knew what I wanted. "I'm willing to risk it too," I whispered, holding his gaze. "For us." The days after my meeting with HR passed like a dream. Alexander and I shared quiet, tender moments that felt even more precious, knowing the risks we were taking. Each touch, each glance, each kiss held an urgency, as if we knew that any moment could bring the end. And with every passing day, my heart only felt more certain. I was falling deeply, irrevocably in love with him. But the secrecy weighed on me. Every time I saw Alexander from across the office, I wanted to run to him, to share something as simple as holding hands or sharing a coffee openly. Yet, we continued our careful dance of stolen moments, our desire hidden behind closed doors and quiet whispers. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and cast a warm golden light through his office window, Alexander pulled me close, his arms wrapping around me as he buried his face in my hair. His touch was gentle but firm, and I could feel his heart beating against mine. "Amelia," he murmured, his voice soft yet filled with something heavy, something unresolved. "We can't keep hiding like this forever. I want to be with you, truly with you." I looked up, meeting his gaze, my heart aching with a mixture of longing and fear. "I want that too, Alexander," I whispered. "But how?" "The company." He sighed, his hand moving to gently cup my face, his thumb brushing softly over my cheek. "There's a way," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I could leave my position here. Start something new. I'd be free to be with you, and there'd be nothing to keep us apart." His words hung between us, and I felt a rush of emotions. Hope, relief, and something deeper. The idea of Alexander leaving his role, a job he had poured his heart into, for me was overwhelming. I reached up, placing my hand on his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my touch. "Would you really do that?" I asked, my voice catching. "Give up everything you've worked for?" He held my gaze, a slow, gentle smile spreading across his face. "For you, Amelia? Yes, I would. Because nothing is worth more to me than you are." His words were like a promise, filling me with a quiet joy I hadn't known was possible. I leaned in, letting our lips meet in a kiss that felt like a vow. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just in love with him. I wanted a future with him, one where we could be together, without secrets or fear. A few days later, Alexander scheduled a meeting with the board. I waited anxiously in my office, my mind racing with thoughts of how everything would change. I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and nervousness, my heart beating wildly as I imagined a life with Alexander. One where we could finally be open, where our love wouldn't be a secret. The hours ticked by slowly, and it felt like an eternity before I heard a soft knock on my office door. I looked up, my breath catching as Alexander stepped inside. His face calm but his eyes filled with warmth and relief. "It's done," he said softly, closing the door behind him. "I told the board I would be stepping down in a few weeks. We can leave together, start fresh." A rush of happiness flooded through me, and before I could stop myself, I threw my arms around him, holding him tightly. "You really did it?" I whispered, feeling a mix of disbelief and gratitude. "Yes," he murmured, his arms wrapping around me as he pulled me close. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life. Amelia, you're all I want." I pulled back slightly, looking up at him, my heart swelling with love. I want you too, Alexander, I said softly. More than anything. We shared a quiet, joyful moment together, savoring the reality of our choice. As the day drew to a close, we decided to take one final drive through the city, our favorite way to escape, to be together. We laughed, sharing memories, and as we drove past the places that had witnessed our first glances, our first kisses, I felt a deep peace settle over me. This was it, this was real. A few weeks later, Alexander's resignation became official. It spread through the office like wildfire, leaving whispers and rumors in its wake. The HR department, despite its initial disapproval, had come to terms with it. Now that Alexander had stepped down, there was no longer any rule we were breaking. We could finally be free. Our first day together, openly and without restraint, felt like a dream. He met me at the front of the office, his hand reaching for mine as he pulled me into a warm, lingering embrace. There was no more hiding, no more secrecy, only the quiet joy of finally being able to hold each other without fear. In the weeks that followed, we built a new life together, one filled with lazy Sunday mornings, late-night talks, and long walks where he'd hold my hand and tell me all the ways he loved me. With Alexander, I felt like I had found something rare, something precious. I smiled, my heart swelling as I met his gaze. "Tell me." He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. "You've changed everything for me. Before you, I thought I had everything I wanted. But now, I can't imagine a life without you by my side." A tear slipped down my cheek, and I laughed softly, brushing it away. "You have me," I whispered. "Always." As he held me close, I realized that all the fear, the secrecy, and the risks had been worth it. Our love had weathered every challenge, and now, standing in his arms, I knew we had found something lasting. Months later, we found ourselves in a small, quiet cafe, sipping coffee on a rainy afternoon. Alexander reached across the table, taking my hand in his thumb gently stroking my skin. "Amelia," he began, his voice soft yet steady, "there's something I've wanted to ask you." I looked at him, my heart fluttering as his gaze held mine. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a delicate ring that sparkled in the dim light. My breath caught as I stared, my heart pounding with a joy I hadn't anticipated. "Will you marry me, Amelia?" he asked, his voice filled with a quiet hope that made my heart swell. Tears filled my eyes as I nodded, a smile spreading across my face. "Yes," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto my finger, and as he leaned across the table, our lips met in a kiss filled with the promise of forever. In his arms, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be.